There is something almost paradoxical about walking with no clear destination. In a world that often measures worth by movement, by targets set, milestones reached, and destinations conquered, to walk without one is considered strange, unproductive, aimless. But the Stoics knew something most forget. Not all journeys are meant to arrive. Some are meant to shed. On certain streets in ancient Rome, long before the rumble of traffic replaced footsteps and voices, men like Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus would walk slowly, not to reach a place but to release the weight of thought. They were not seeking escape. They were not meditating in the modern sense. They were practicing presence, a grounded awareness that saw everything, including suffering, not as a barrier but as a teacher. The Stoics didn't walk to forget the world. They walked to remember how to live in it. Their movements were simple, measured. Stoicism, after all, was not loud. It didn't demand robes or temples. It didn't ask for ascetic theatrics. It asked only for honesty. And honesty is easiest found in motion. Aurelius, during his reign as emperor, often found himself surrounded by decisions, expectations, judgments, and weighty matters of empire. But in the quiet moments, before the roar of the Senate or the demands of generals, he wrote of simplicity, of walking through gardens, of watching how ants build and birds move. He observed that the universe was in motion and that motion was often cyclical. Day followed night. Winter gave way to spring. Things decayed and returned to soil. Even the stars circled above. What, then, was the role of man? To walk, perhaps, not toward glory, not toward fame, but toward clarity. And clarity, as it happens, is best found not by chasing, but by observing. Aurelius's walks were often private. He had no need to impress. When he did walk with others, tutors, philosophers, soldiers, he asked more questions than he answered. This habit, inherited from the Socratics, was the foundation of the Stoic method. Not preaching but probing. Not teaching through dominance but through calm. One record, kept by a slave-turned-secretary, speaks of an afternoon when Aurelius stopped mid-path near a withered fig tree. He had been speaking with Junius Rusticus about duty. The emperor bent down, touched the dry leaves, and asked, "Is this decay or preparation?" Rusticus, wise in silence, said nothing. The two men stood there until the sun shifted slightly. That moment became a lesson. Not because of what was said, but because of what was felt. Decay is not failure. It is the prelude to renewal. A fig tree must lose its leaves to gather strength for spring. So too must the mind release clutter to find its rhythm. And so the Stoics walked, not to conquer but to clear. This form of movement, quiet and slow, became a metaphor for their inner life. Stoicism teaches that the external world, filled with noise, opinion, chaos, is beyond control. The only realm of mastery lies within. And what better way to explore that inner realm than by walking through the outer one gently with no expectation? Epictetus, born a slave and later freed, walked not in gardens but in alleys. His steps carried the memory of hardship. He limped from an early injury, and yet his gait was steady, purposeful. In his teachings, walking appears not as an escape but as embodiment. We are not disturbed by things, he would say, but by the views we take of things. And so, when his students complained of anxious minds, he advised not more thought but more walking. "The mind untangles in motion," he once wrote. "Let the feet speak when the tongue is tired." This advice, seemingly simple, held layers. The Stoic walk was not a performance. It was not the indulgent stroll of the idle, nor the frantic pacing of the nervous. It was measured like a metronome of discipline. It trained the body to align with thought. It reminded the walker that life too must be paced. The city of Rome was not quiet. Markets bustled. Roads were uneven. Soldiers barked orders. Yet within this chaos, the Stoic walk carved a silent line. Those who practiced it seemed to move differently. Not slowly but intentionally. Their eyes did not dart. Their shoulders did not tighten. They did not rush, and yet they did not waste time. This was the paradox they embraced. Walking without destination but never aimless. Thinking without obsession but never shallow. Feeling without indulgence but never numb. In the portico of the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch where the philosophy first took its name, Zeno of Citium once walked for hours. The colored frescoes depicted battles and legends, but Zeno paid them no mind. His steps were inward. He was watching his reactions, observing the rise of frustration, the tug of pride. He was not trying to kill these emotions. He was befriending them, seeing them as weather, passing and teachable. To walk without destination is not to drift. It is to allow the terrain of the mind to present itself. Some mornings, Zeno stopped and stood still for long minutes before taking another step. Observers thought him strange. But Zeno, later asked, replied, "I was waiting for the next thought to lose its urgency." He understood that the Stoic way was not about momentum but balance. Between thought and silence. Between motion and rest. Between the impulse to act and the wisdom to wait. On the edge of the Tiber River, not far from the Palatine Hill, there was a footpath worn smooth by centuries of sandals and bare feet. Here, in a quieter stretch of Rome, one could sometimes find young students of philosophy walking in pairs or alone, reciting not mantras but questions. This too was part of the Stoic exercise, a kind of meditative interrogation of the self. What is within my control? What am I fearing today? Am I responding or merely reacting? These were not rhetorical. The questions served as trail markers, guiding the mind inward even as the feet moved outward. The path by the Tiber bore no destination. It looped and branched, fading into reeds and small stones. But the act of walking it, again and again, imprinted lessons into muscle and breath. Seneca, the prolific Roman Stoic, believed that philosophy should be practiced, not preached. To walk without purpose, in his eyes, was not wasteful. It was revealing. In one of his letters he writes of wandering the courtyard of his villa at dusk, letting thoughts settle like dust. The stillness of evening helped him distinguish between what was merely urgent and what was truly important. "The body tires," he wrote, "but the mind begins to float once it's released from chasing." Seneca's evening walks were never announced, never accompanied. He considered them a kind of private audit. He would walk and review the day, not to judge himself harshly but to notice. To ask, where did I fall short of reason? When did I allow external chaos to infect my interior peace? This was the Stoic rhythm. Walk, observe, reflect. The modern world often misunderstands Stoicism as cold or detached. But those who walked its paths knew better. Their detachment was not from life, but from noise, from clutter, from unnecessary drama. The Stoic walk was a clearing, not of landscape but of lens. In some traditions, walking is prayer. In others, protest. For the Stoics, it was a return to balance, to alignment, to breath. By walking without destination, they trained themselves to live without clinging. A philosopher in motion could meet joy or sorrow with the same posture. He could face insult or praise with equal grace, because he had practiced the one thing no storm could take: composure. The Stoic way of walking did not require wilderness. It did not demand silence or seclusion. It could happen in a market, a battlefield, a temple, or a garden. What mattered was the orientation: inward, aware, aligned. To walk in this sense was to choose philosophy not just as an idea but as a gate. And so they walked. Not to escape pain but to understand it. Not to avoid the world but to face it with steadier feet. Not to prove anything but to unlearn everything unnecessary. In the footfalls of those long gone, a rhythm remains. Soft, intentional. Quiet as wind passing through columns of worn stone. Their destination was never marked on any map. In the later years of the Roman Republic, when political alliances were shifting like riverbanks in spring, the schools of Stoicism remained remarkably still. Not stagnant but grounded. Inside the colonnades of academies, sometimes modest stone rooms, other times open gardens framed by sunlit arches, students of Stoicism trained not only in thought but in motion. It was a curious feature of their instruction, one rarely noted in surviving manuscripts. Walking was not merely encouraged, it was structured. It was not a break from learning but part of it. A ritual, deliberate and slow, practiced like a language of discipline. At the Stoic schools near the Esquiline Hill, instructors would often begin the day not with lecture but with steps. Young learners, still drowsy from sleep or inner debate, would be invited into the gravel paths that wove through carefully tended olive groves. There were no seats, no scrolls, just gravel, sandals, and questions. A teacher would pose a simple statement: pain is not evil, or fortune is indifferent, and then fall silent. The students would walk, some alone, others in twos. The rule was to let the phrase echo silently in the mind, to examine it not with rebuttal but with curiosity. Could the phrase be held without argument? Could it be worn like a robe touched from the inside? The instructors understood that the body was not separate from the mind. A distracted walk could expose a distracted thought. A hurried gait might reflect resistance. If a student tripped, stumbled, or forgot to breathe, the philosophy had not yet taken root. Stoic walking was a diagnostic. It was in these gardens that a young Lucilius, not yet the famous correspondent of Seneca, first began to understand Stoicism as rhythm. He had entered the school after years of restless ambition. He was sharp, clever with speech, but unable to sleep. His questions came quickly like darts. But it was during walks, when there were no listeners to impress, that his mind began to soften. Seneca, observing him, once said, "You will not outrun your suffering by running faster. Walk with it. Watch it walk beside you. That is the beginning of mastery." In time, Lucilius learned to pace his thoughts with his breath. Each step became an opportunity to notice what rose inside him: resentment, regret, pride, hope. Not to scold them but to observe, like clouds, like passing birds. This was the core of Stoic training: not to numb emotion but to recognize its shape without being carried by it. In those early morning sessions, the garden took on the quality of a mirror. Trees did not judge. Stones had no opinion. The world, when observed in motion, revealed its nature, ever shifting yet never chaotic. To walk within it, slowly and with presence, was to begin understanding it. Rituals formed. Students would begin their day with a silent walk, rehearsing adversity before it arrived. What if I lose my home? What if insult comes from a friend? What if health fades? These were not fatalistic musings, but rehearsals of resilience. The Stoics called it premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. And the best setting for such rehearsal? A quiet walk when the body was calm and the air still cool. Later, these students would gather for discourse, but the walking always preceded the talking. A restless body could not house a tranquil mind. One young woman, Almatia, daughter of a merchant, became known for her silence during walks. She never interrupted, never gestured. She simply walked and listened. One day, during a group discussion, she was asked why she said so little. She replied, "Because I cannot hear the stone under my heel and speak of the cosmos at the same time. I must choose one." Her words became part of the school's teachings. Even in maturity, the habit endured. Older philosophers continued their walking practice not for health, but for sanity. Rome was loud. Life was urgent. But walking offered a narrowing, a deliberate withdrawal from distraction. The feet were like anchors dropped into the present. When news of war reached the city, many panicked. But the Stoics walked, not in denial but to prepare the soul. They practiced equanimity not by withdrawing from reality, but by rehearsing their place within it. One Stoic teacher, Calvus, would walk even in rain. His students thought it eccentric, even unnecessary. But Calvus insisted, the body must learn that discomfort is not a command. Wetness is not tragedy. Let the skin know what the mind must endure. He would walk in silence, soaked to the bone, and afterward dry himself without complaint, because they were already home. The act of walking became a vocabulary of resistance. Resistance not to the world but to one's own false urgencies. Evenings, too, were sacred for walking. After the bustle of day, the Stoics would revisit the gravel paths, this time to review. It was not a dramatic review, not guilt-ridden nor filled with declarations. Just questions softly held. Did I act in accordance with reason? Or did I confuse opinion with fact? Did I take more than I gave? They walked until the questions softened, until the judgments fell away, until only reflection remained. This ritual became known informally as ambulation of accountability. The term never reached formal doctrine, but was spoken among students with reverence. To walk one's day, step by step, until its weight no longer pressed. In the rhythm of heel and toe, breath and air, the Stoics discovered what temples could not offer: the practice of returning. To what? To reason, to self, to silence. In the shadowed years after the Antonine Plague, when sickness drifted through the cities like morning fog and grief etched itself into the faces of the living, walking became something different for the Stoics. It was no longer merely an instrument of philosophical training. It became a way to carry sorrow without being broken by it. Loss, even to the Stoic mind, was not denied. It was expected. The unpredictability of life, its fragile design, its constant shifting, was part of nature's script. But to expect sorrow did not mean to feel it less. It meant learning how to hold it, how to walk with it gently without collapsing. The philosopher Cato the Younger, remembered for his fierce integrity and resistance to tyranny, once wandered the hills outside Utica in the early dusk. His son had died of fever. There was no public mourning, no cries of lamentation. Cato simply walked. His steps left shallow prints in the red earth, his eyes fixed not on the horizon, but on the movement of his own feet. Those who saw him said nothing. They understood. Cato was not running from his grief, nor denying its weight. He was allowing it to settle, to take its rightful place beside him. In every step he remembered, not to relive the pain but to acknowledge its reality. The Stoics believed that emotion, like weather, must be observed without panic. To deny its presence was folly, but to allow it to master the self, that too was failure. So they walked, not to distract but to clarify. A story from Epictetus's school tells of a man named Marcellus, who lost his wife and daughter to a sudden illness. He returned to the classroom after only 3 days. His face was hollowed, his voice thin. When asked how he could bear to return so soon, he replied, "The body carries what the spirit cannot, if the steps are steady." Each morning after, Marcellus would walk the perimeter of the school's outer wall 5 times before entering. His friends noted that his expression softened over weeks, that his shoulders began to release their tightness. He did not speak often of the dead, but he spoke differently of the living, with more patience, less insistence. For the Stoics, grief was not to be conquered. It was to be integrated. Seneca, in his letters, wrote of the sorrow he felt upon the loss of his child. He did not mask his anguish. "I weep," he said plainly, "but not without measure." His remedy was motion. He would rise early, walk slowly through the orchard, and allow the morning air to sift through his sorrow. He described the walk as a distillation. The grief would not vanish, but its edges would dull. The rage within it would soften. And in that softening, memory could return without wounding. It was during these walks that Seneca coined one of his quietest aphorisms: "To walk is to carry fire without burning." The flame of pain, the loss, the ache, all could be held if cradled rightly, if moved gently without sudden grip. Across Rome, in the quieter quarters of the Aventine, older Stoics began encouraging grief walks. Not processions, not ceremonies, but simple ambulations. When a loved one died, it became custom for the bereaved to walk for 7 days at dawn. No black robes, no chants, just walking, breathing, listening. At first many resisted. The idea seemed too plain, too undramatic. But over time the tradition revealed its wisdom. On the 5th day the breath deepened. On the 6th the shoulders lowered. And by the 7th, while the sorrow remained, it had changed shape. It no longer ruled. It accompanied. This transformation was not spoken of, not celebrated. It was known only by the one who walked it. In a small village on the island of Rhodes, a former centurion named Fabius kept a habit long after retirement. Each year, on the day his brother had died in battle, he walked the entire edge of the town before sunrise. Not to remember the death, but to remember the bond. Along the route he would pass places they once laughed, a market stall, a quiet fountain. He did not cry. He did not speak. But by the time he returned, his face had softened. In the margin of his journal, later found by a friend, he had written, "My brother is the sound of my feet on the path. Still here. Just quieter." This was the Stoic understanding of remembrance. Not clinging to images but carrying essence. Grief to them was not weakness. It was the echo of connection. And to walk with it, not to cage it nor to flee it, was an act of quiet strength. Not every grief was caused by death. Some came from disappointment, betrayal, or the collapse of long-held hopes. The Stoics understood this too. Loss was not always marked by funeral fire or silence in the home. Sometimes it was the fading of an ambition. A friendship turned cold. A child gone astray. For these wounds, walking offered a way not to resolve but to reflect. The philosopher Musonius Rufus often spoke of the heavy mornings, those days when the mind wakes already full of burden. On such days he advised no immediate study, no conversation, just movement, a path through trees if possible, or if not, a quiet lane with nothing to sell, nothing to prove. He once said, "If the mind rises broken, do not press it with thought. Let the legs begin the thinking." His students followed suit. Those suffering heartbreak or despair would meet at dawn and walk together, not to speak but to avoid solitude's illusions. They called it silent accompaniment. No one was tasked with cheer. No one asked for details. They walked as proof that suffering shared need not be named to be witnessed. In the northern provinces, where days could pass under gray skies and mist, Stoic settlers developed walking meditations rooted in the rhythm of breath and step. They taught that each step should release something: a regret, a fear, an unspoken anger. The feet moved as the mind loosened. There were no mantras, no prescribed prayers. Only this: take the pain with you, but do not let it choose the pace. Even the greatest among them, Marcus Aurelius, wrestled with weariness. In his meditations, composed between battles and decrees, he returns often to walking. He writes not of grand parades or stately marches, but of solitary paths, the feel of earth, the sound of wind and grass. He did not walk to escape his empire, but to remind himself of what lay beneath it: mortality, fragility, the impermanence of power. On one particularly cold morning after a sleepless night, he walked the garden of his villa. He noticed the frost melting unevenly across the stone. One patch melted fast in sun, another remained covered in shadow. "So too the soul," he wrote. "Some parts awaken quickly, others remain slow. One must not scorn the slow thaw." Therein lay the grace of Stoic walking. It was not about pace or progress. It was about consent to change, about allowing sorrow to soften, not vanish. In the late years of his life, Marcus instructed his son to continue the habit, even if he did not understand it. "Walk when troubled," he advised. "And if not troubled, walk still, for trouble is never far." The legacy of this practice extended far beyond Rome. In monastic traditions influenced by Stoic principles, walking meditation became a form of prayer. In certain Eastern Mediterranean villages, elder women would trace the same route each evening with their hands clasped, not to pray aloud, but to steady the heart. They had no name for it, but it was Stoicism in motion. To walk while grieving then was not a failure to cope. It was the beginning of wisdom. In the decades following the golden age of Roman Stoicism, as the empire expanded and administrative burdens deepened, the quiet rituals of the philosophers began to shift from individual habit into something larger, something cultural, even political. Walking, once a tool for inner clarity and grief processing, found new footing as a civic and military discipline. It became a metaphor not just for personal resilience, but for the rhythm of leadership, the ethics of presence, and the responsibility of being seen by others. The path one walked no longer belonged solely to the self. It echoed outward. Among Roman statesmen, this evolution was subtle but deliberate. The tradition of the morning promenade, once a solitary stroll along the Tiber or under colonnades, became a public gesture of steadiness. A governor might walk through the market at dawn, not for inspection but as a symbol. I walk the same ground as those I govern. Civic leaders influenced by Stoic training understood that stability was not declared. It was modeled. The sight of a leader walking calmly through public spaces, not in parade, not in guarded procession, but alone or with a scribe, offered something rare: emotional predictability in uncertain times. This ritual of visible composure was particularly pronounced during political unrest. In the weeks before elections or during grain shortages, a Stoic official might be seen walking slowly through the forum, nodding at vendors, pausing at water basins, acknowledging the crowd with brief gestures. His pace was steady, his clothing modest, his silence deliberate. These were not theatrics. They were Stoic cues, invitations for the public to slow their own hearts, to trust order, to meet chaos with breath, not panic. In military settings, the integration of Stoic walking became even more profound. The Roman legions, already trained in synchronized movement, began to incorporate philosophical walks into their regimen for officers and elite guards. These were not marches but reflective drills, slow paces in silence, undertaken in the early morning before strategy meetings. The idea was simple but radical. Before commanding others, one must first command the self. A commander who could walk alone, without haste or distraction, was seen as having clarity of judgment. A restless gait might suggest indecision. A heavy tread, unresolved anger. The subtleties of footfall became part of an unspoken evaluation. In military journals, some officers described their walk of sorting, a half-hour before battle during which they would walk the perimeter of their camp, not to review logistics but to clear the fog of ego and fear. Many credited this ritual with saving their lives, not through strategy but through restraint. A calm mind shoots straighter. A quiet heart makes cleaner decisions. The most famous of these commanders was Aelius Verus, stationed in the Germanic provinces. Known for his temper in youth, he became legendary in maturity for his calm leadership. His soldiers remarked that before every major engagement he would walk alone by the tree line, pausing often, sometimes speaking to no one for hours. They came to trust his silence more than other men's shouting. When asked about this habit, he once replied, "I do not walk to find courage. I walk to remember what fear forgets, that the worst thing I can lose is not life but reason." The Stoic walk was not passive. It was not withdrawal. It was the recentering of judgment. Even beyond politics and the military, Stoic walking influenced broader Roman society. Artisans and merchants began to imitate the practice in their own ways. Some market stall owners would walk the length of their rows at dawn in silence before the day's commerce began. This was not superstition. It was calibration, a moment to align inward values before entering the noise of trade. In homes where Stoic influence lingered, children were taught to take 3 slow walks a week with an elder. Not as punishment, not even as instruction, simply to learn rhythm, patience, and observation. In these walks, an elder might point out how ivy wrapped differently around each pillar, how dogs responded to tone more than command, how shadows fell longer on cobbled stones after rain. These were not lessons in botany or animal behavior. They were lessons in presence, training the young mind to witness before it judged. Writers, too, were shaped by the culture of Stoic walking. Poets describe city alleys as the straight philosophers, and fountains as masters of silence. Scrolls began to include marginal notes about the location where a thought was first conceived, written near the western portico after my 4th lap. Ideas were no longer separate from motion. Wisdom had footsteps. As Rome aged and its rhythms became louder, quicker, more commercial, the Stoic way of walking began to recede from daily life. The streets that once carried the slow footfall of calm minds now filled with merchants shouting prices, wheels grinding stone, and the urgency of an empire more focused on outward might than inner clarity. Philosophy, once walked, became increasingly confined to study rooms and parchment. It shifted from movement to manuscript, from path to podium. The shift was not immediate, nor was it absolute. But over generations, the simplicity of the Stoic stroll lost its centrality. Where once a teacher's authority rested as much in how he walked as in what he said, now it lay in citations, in lineage, in the precision of arguments copied from older works. In the heart of Alexandria, libraries bloomed, and with them came scholars. Many still referenced Stoic principles, still quoted Epictetus or Marcus Aurelius, but fewer lived them. The daily walking practice, once considered the philosopher's physical prayer, now seemed quaint in a world where knowledge grew abstract. The very urban structures that had once nurtured the Stoic walk, colonnades, cloisters, garden paths, gave way to tighter alleys and more efficient architecture. Markets encroached on spaces of quiet. Leisure narrowed. Silence became rare. A century after the final years of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher Hierocles, a later Stoic thinker, commented on the change. In one of his surviving fragments he writes, "Now we think ourselves wise when seated and call it learning when not lived." He mourned the loss of what he called perambulare sapientiae, the walking of wisdom. Some resisted the shift. In distant provinces, certain schools kept the tradition alive. In a small courtyard near what is now southern Spain, records tell of an old Stoic named Aelianus who taught young farmers not in lectures, but on slow walks between olive trees. He had no scrolls. His curriculum was seasonal. One day he would walk and speak of patience as leaves fell from vines. Another day he would walk and speak of acceptance, watching a crop fail under frost. He told them that walking was the one movement that never betrayed the thinker. It neither raced ahead of emotion nor drowned it. It matched it, gently, reliably, honestly. But these outposts grew fewer. And with the rise of Christian monasticism and later scholastic philosophy, The bodily movement of thought was replaced with liturgical order and textual debate. A different kind of reflection emerged, no less deep but less mobile. The Stoic walk, as it once was, faded into history. In later centuries, as thinkers began to reflect on the ancient world, they found themselves drawn not only to Stoic doctrines, but to their habits. The Enlightenment philosophers in Europe centuries later admired the calm of Marcus Aurelius and the rigor of Seneca. Some tried to imitate them, but they often missed the movement. One exception was Michel de Montaigne, who, in the 16th century, spent hours walking the grounds of his estate, musing aloud. His essays, rich with philosophical insight, emerged not from seated study but from motion. He once remarked, "My mind will not move unless my legs do." In this he echoed the ancients. Later still, Nietzsche would adopt walking as central to his thinking. In the mountains of Switzerland, he claimed that all truly great thoughts are conceived while walking. Yet his walking bore urgency, even agitation, different from the even pace of the Stoics. For them, walking was not a provocation. It was a calibration, a rhythm that reminded the soul how to carry itself without force. In the modern age, few know of Sabinus the Thin or of Marcellus and his silent lapse. But their footsteps remain, echoed in the idea that motion itself can heal, that one does not need to arrive to understand. Urban life now rushes. Screens flash. Notifications replace inner stillness. But there are those who, instinctively or by rediscovery, return to the ancient path. They walk, in parks, on quiet roads, around their own small gardens, not to burn calories or chase goals, but to remember. To remember that wisdom is not only what is known, but how it is moved through. They walk as the Stoics did, without destination, without noise, with breath steady and mind unclenched. And in that something returns, not a doctrine, not a dogma, but a kind of peace, a kind of presence, the same presence that once paced the porticos of Rome before sunrise, that once turned grief into rhythm, that once made silence a companion and breath a teacher. It returns quietly like all important things, in footsteps, in stillness between steps, in the spaces modernity forgets to honor. And when it returns, it does not demand recognition. It asks only to be walked. In the quiet corners of the modern world, where noise is constant and stillness scarce, the ancient practice of walking without destination quietly returns. It does not return in grand declarations or public rituals. It comes quietly, in early morning footsteps through suburban streets, in lunchtime laps around a city park, in twilight walks that trace the edges of a day's anxiety. It returns not as nostalgia but as necessity. The modern world, so rich in information, is impoverished in integration. Thoughts arrive faster than they can be processed. Emotions are triggered before they are understood. In this momentum, the body becomes an afterthought, a vessel that must keep pace. But in walking, particularly walking with no purpose beyond presence, a different rhythm asserts itself. One that the ancients understood well. In Tokyo, a young office worker begins his day with 20 minutes of walking beneath cherry blossoms. He does not check his phone. He counts his breath. Step inhale. Step exhale. The city pulses beyond the path, but he does not chase it. His gait becomes his compass. In Sao Paulo, A retired schoolteacher walks each evening just after dinner. Her route loops through the same garden paths she once rushed through. Now each flower, each shifting shadow on the stone, becomes part of her meditation. She whispers to herself phrases of Stoic wisdom, not loudly but like affirmations smoothed by time. In Cape Town, a philosophy student begins to walk during study breaks, having read how Musonius Rufus once used walking to steady the heart before debate. There is no competition now, no audience, but the habit grounds the day. The foot, the breath, the sky above, all reminders of limits and of presence. In these quiet acts, the Stoic tradition breathes again. Modernity often promises optimization. Even walking is rebranded. Steps counted, calories measured, paths charted on apps that reward efficiency. But the Stoic walk resists this. It refuses to be measured. It cannot be scheduled or optimized. Its purpose is not movement but mindfulness. To walk without destination is to make a stand, not against technology or change, but against the erosion of inner quiet. It is a choice to experience time in a different key. The thinkers of old knew this. Their wisdom was not just in their words but in their habits. They walked not to escape but to see clearly. In the absence of distraction, truth appeared. Not grand truths, but small, honest ones. About what hurts, what helps, what endures. This insight, that understanding emerges not from racing to answers but from walking through questions, is what modern Stoic walkers rediscover. And they are not alone. In hospitals, therapists now walk with patients through recovery gardens. The slow pace allows grief to speak where words fail. In schools, teachers guide anxious students on short reflective walks. Even the most restless child finds calm when their body leads and their thoughts follow. Some mindfulness programs now integrate Stoic texts, not as doctrine but as direction. They read, "Let the mind be still and the body gentle." Then they walk, step by step, not toward silence but with it. In homes, people walk hallways in moments of tension, not pacing in frustration but moving gently to let emotion settle. This, too, is a kind of walking the Stoics would recognize. The old paths may have crumbled, but the principle remains. Walk slowly. Walk mindfully. Do not rush sorrow. Do not chase happiness. Let each step be a statement. I am here and that is enough. Even in cities where movement is constant and silence rare, the Stoic walk can be found. In commuters who turn off music and notice their breath. In neighbors who walk without headphones just to hear the wind through trees. In those who choose to walk home not to save fare but to lose noise. It is not easy. The modern world resists slowness. But it is precisely this resistance that makes the Stoic walk an act of quiet rebellion. A gentle reclaiming of agency. To walk in this way is not to disengage. It is to re-engage on different terms, with dignity, with awareness, with rhythm. In this final movement of the story, the walker is no longer a Roman in a robe or a scholar in sandals. The walker is anyone who chooses stillness in motion. A nurse on break, a parent after bedtime, a writer clearing thought, a grieving friend with no words. The Stoic walk does not demand identity, only intention. Its wisdom is not in arrival but in practice. And so it continues. Not in marble corridors or formal schools, but in sidewalks, garden paths, hallways, and hillsides. It continues in the ordinary, in the forgotten, in the human. And if one listens closely, walking quietly on a morning when the air is cool and the world is not yet awake, one might hear them again. The soft footsteps of those who walked before, not seeking fame or clarity or escape. Only steadiness, only peace, only the next step taken well.